Good morning, everyone. My name is Nicole. I'm the founder and Chief Courage Officer at Neon Shed, which brings light to the dark sides of work. And I am super excited for this morning's session, which we are recording for people who can't make it today. I'd love to introduce you to my friend and associate, Dr. Helen Lawson-Williams, who has a PhD in organizational psychology, so absolutely knows her stuff. And she's also the co-founder of Tank, which is an app that fights burnout. We have connected because we are very aligned in what we do, and Helen is incredible and looks at the root causes and the symptom instead of trying to band-aid, sorry, not the symptom, the causes system instead of trying to band-aid the symptom of burnout. So I love your work. I love what you do, and would love to hand over to you for helping people have stress strategies for leaders.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Nick. I am thrilled, honestly, to be able to talk to your community. And I think that the key thing, exactly as you said, looking at burnout as a system and looking at the components of the system is really, really important. And it's useful to start with stress because we know that burnout is the result, it's the end product of stress that hasn't been managed well over a long period of time. And quite often, what we're offered in terms of managing stress is a bit piecemeal. It's a long list of tips and tricks, or there are acronyms you have to remember, or it's a little bit of a fluid space. So I think we've got something a little bit more strategic that we can offer people, and that's what we're going to do when we talk through it this morning. So if we're ready, let's go. Share my screen. Okay, so don't sink your staff. So what I like to do with these sessions is make them very hands-on, and I'm sorry to do this to you at 8 o'clock in the morning, but right from the first slide, I'm going to get you to think about something that hasn't gone well necessarily. So I'm going to introduce you to one of my favourite entrepreneurs in Australia. This is Ashik Ahmed, who came to the country a couple of decades ago now, not speaking any English, worked hospitality jobs, saw a big opportunity in rostering and created from scratch one of our few unicorns, Deputy. And I had the opportunity to hear him speak last year. And one of the things that he said that really stuck with me is a CEO is a sports person and sport is making decisions. And I love this quote for its flexibility, because that is actually true regardless of what kind of leadership position you're in. It's not just the CEO. Making good decisions about where you spend your time, what you pay attention to, how you tackle a big complex problem, that's all the sport that you're playing right now. And becoming an elite sports person in that field obviously is pretty helpful. So I want you to take a minute just to think about a decision that you made that maybe didn't work out for you the way that you thought it was going to work out. So maybe not the best decision you've made. Just jot it down. Don't have to think too much more about it than that. And we'll move on to the next exercise. So just give you a minute. Okay, it looks like folks are ready to go. So second exercise, this is Adam Grant, who you may have run into as a far more famous organizational psychologist than I am. And one of the quotes from his latest book is, growth is less about how hard you work than about how well you learn. So second exercise, just for a minute, write down a mistake you had to make twice, something you didn't learn from the first time around and had to learn the second time. We've all had them. Okay, we've got one volunteer in the chat, which is same mistakes, hiring too quickly. Yeah, nice one. I don't doubt that most of us have made that mistake. All right. Any other volunteers for examples of decisions that you regretted or mistakes you had to make twice? Feel free to come off mute, obviously, as well, if you want to share. So maybe just think about, are there common themes across those two? Is there something common across a bad decision or a mistake that you had to make twice? Set of circumstances that were happening around you at the time, mental state that you were in, what was common across those two? Yeah, we've got haste or operating out of fear. So definitely a feeling of time pressure in that and moving too quickly, not having all the information. So two quite different, we think about these things as being quite different: decision making, learning lessons, the two separate, very cognitive things. We do these very rationally. But actually, what we know about the way that our brain works with our body is that our performance is very strongly influenced by where we are in the level of activation, the level of arousal that our physiological body is in. So, broadly speaking, we can talk about on the x axis here being calm, we can be challenged, or we can be overwhelmed. So, very low activation on the left, very high activation on the right, and a kind of sweet spot in the middle. And the reason we know it's a sweet spot is that on the y axis, which isn't labeled here, we have performance. And we know that performance on complex tasks, we know leadership is a complex task, your performance is much, much better in the middle of that zone than it is on either side. When you're too calm, you're just not motivated, not focused enough to do great work. When you're overwhelmed by potentially too much information, a lot of time pressure, you're just not going to perform well. That's where bad decisions happen, and that's where you have to make the second mistake before you learn it. So what does that look like? Performance, learning, and flow happens in the middle. Fight, flight, freeze, which is typically the state that we're in when we're making poor decisions, is what happens on the right. And over on the left is your rest, recover, regroup. Now, there's a couple of things to take away from this chart. Firstly, it's one of the few things in psychology that's actually known as a law. There's so much research behind this that we can really rely on this one. So you quite often hear that there are things in psychology that suffer from a replication problem. They're not that reliable. This is not one of those. This is very reliable. It works for humans. It works for all mammals that have been studied. The second thing is we can get trapped into thinking that all stress is bad. So challenged and overwhelmed, it's all stress. We're all trying to get rid of all of it. Not the case. We absolutely want to be spending some time in challenged each day, or we're not going to do our best work. But it's a peak performance. And just like a mountaintop, you don't want to spend your whole time up there, right? You're going to run out of oxygen. And very often, when people are trying to spend all their time in that zone, what happens is they tumble off to the right without meaning to. So deliberately building in this cycle between challenged and calm is what's going to give you the best performance over the long term rather than just in the moment. Any questions there before I move on? Oh, good. Excellent. Maybe everyone's just tired on a Friday morning, but in any case, let's move on. So I'm going to break some visual communication rules here. I'm going to flip this x-axis onto a y in a minute. But I'm just going to run through what those two states are that we're talking about. So on that left-hand side, we've got the part of your autonomic nervous system called the parasympathetic nervous system in charge, your rest and digest, your hammock and your fish feast on the left-hand side. That's where you are when you're calm. And when you're stressed, you've got your sympathetic nervous system in charge. So that's the flight and fight, all the F words. And what's important to take away, I think, from this is that on the left-hand side, what you're doing is topping up resources. What your body is doing is clearing the side effects of the stress response. It's clearing cortisol and other stress hormones. It's repairing any damage that's been done, and it's recouping resources for the next round of stress. So this is not a thing that is just that 10 minutes of meditation that you quite often get advised to do to manage stress. This is actually a longer exercise, and obviously sleep is one of the key things to do here, but it's not the only thing. On the right-hand side, even if it's good stress, even if it's that high performance stress, it is still draining your resources. So two parts of the nervous system, autonomic nervous system, to bear in mind, they're fundamentally in tension with one another. When one's in charge, it is repressing the other one. And there's some early research to suggest that when they're in perfect balance is when you get into flow. And that's why it's so hard to maintain, but feels so good while you're in it. That's a little early, but it's really useful to know that these two kind of suppress each other, their intention. So what does that mean? So when you flip that x-axis onto the y, like I said before, over time, which is now that x-axis, we're moving from left to right through time, what we evolved to do was to travel regularly in these loops between calm and challenged, calm and challenged. So from 1 to 2, back to 1, back to 2. We would obviously have had to deal with big stresses, you know, the lion out of the bushes is the classic example, or the threat from someone from a different group, an out group attacking our group. There would definitely have been times in early evolutionary life where we would have had to deal with that kind of overwhelmed peak. But coming back down into calm at the end of the day, storytelling, this is what we evolved to do. So we didn't evolve to be in one state all the time. We evolved to alternate between them. There's another thing to take out of this flow over time is that it's not a perfect symmetrical curve. You'll see it's more a sawtooth. We go into stress extremely quickly. So you will, if it, under a big stressor like that one from calm up to level 3 there, you will go from having sensed a threat to having moved away from the threat in a quarter of a second without even having registered it. So a quarter of a second is about what it takes for your body to, for your brain to sense a threat and for it to send your body into action. It can take up to a day to come down the other side. So there is a big difference between our body's ability to get into stress and our ability to get back out of it again. So this is what we evolved to do. What are we doing right now? Well, we're doing a couple of things. We are often filling in what could be calm time with not calm time. We are filling it with busy work. We're dealing with emails. We're going to meetings that aren't useful. There's a million things that we do at work that fill in that potential calm time, and that we do to our teams to fill in that potential calm time, because we've been taught to utilize our resources to the absolute maximum. So we're stopping people from getting into calm during the course of the day. And over time, we also internalize that pattern. We start to feel guilty if we're in calm. It starts to feel uncomfortable. For some of us who get very addicted to that sense of being busy, 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 we start to feel bored in calm. It starts to feel like a really uncomfortable place to be. That doesn't make it any less important to get into, and to get into for more than the 10-minute meditation exercise. The second thing that happens, because we've reset our baseline now, so our baseline used to be somewhere between calm and challenged. Our baseline's now probably pretty solidly in challenged. So we're starting to tend towards chronic stress. What happens then is that those extra challenges that come up during the day, you know, the cranky email that you get from a client, or, you know, someone from a different department questioning a decision that's been made for months and you've been working on, all the things that happen during the course of the day, which once upon a time might have taken you from calm up to challenged, suddenly now are taking you into overwhelmed and beyond, right? They're pushing you past what used to be a high performance peak, a place where you'd really be able to nail that situation, into a situation where you're feeling under time pressure. You're feeling like there's too much information coming at you. Same situation, different starting point physiologically. So we're adding that stress and we're constantly raising the baseline for ourselves if this is the way we're operating. And that sets a new pattern for where you're spending most of your time. And you can see that in this new set of curves, it's taking longer. It just naturally takes longer to get back down into that calm zone. So it's very easy for this to become a downward spiral where you're spending more time in stress. It's taking you longer to get into calm. And that means that it's easier to get into that peak overwhelmed zone, right in those hot pink areas, the number 3 zone that I was talking about before. So you've gone from, what we were physiologically designed to do to cope with our kind of evolutionary environment to a world where we're just constantly hyper aroused. And for that reason, not doing our best work. And when we're in that state, it's also really, really hard not to then share it, not necessarily deliberately, but it's very hard to keep that physiological state to ourselves. We quite often are sharing that inadvertently with our team, which then puts them into that state as well. Any questions there? Cool. All right, let's move on.
I have a question.
Oh, yeah,
Sorry.
go, baby. No, go for it.
The boredom piece really resonated with me. I think that's the one thing that I've always been fighting. Have you got any advice?
I think there's a good portion of this which is, I'm a big believer in awareness creates choice and choice creates change. So I think just noticing when you're bored, or what you're identifying as boredom, maybe is a better way of describing it. So
I
noticing when you're
identified
bored.
as bored.
Yeah, exactly. So notice it. Just start by noticing it and ask yourself if the response to that sensation is really more stimulation, or if the response to that sensation is actually, can I reframe this as I am relaxed at this point? I think that's a good question to ask yourself. Have a little experiment. Let's see. So I've got a couple of other comments here. We have to give ourselves permission to rest and relax. Oh yes, permission. I'm a big fan of the permission note. You have permission tonight, this weekend, whatever it might be, to just lie down and read a book. Gosh, imagine that. And being bored is a good thing. I tell you what, boredom is not only great for, not too much of it, right? Like, I get it, but boredom is a terrific indicator that you're in a relaxed state. But it's also really important for creativity, and that's not the topic of this talk, I know. But I'm such a big advocate of just a bit more boredom than we usually allow ourselves. And I've also got, thanks for the clear explanation. I can see how this applies to my personal life too. Oh, so important. Yes, yeah. So it's not all about work. I love that that's already come up. Yeah, because stress comes from home. Recovery sometimes comes from work. So if you're paying attention to some of the things that you're doing at work, which actually put you into that chill zone, when you have a really good working session with someone, you're kind of moving through the work and you're creative, that's flow zone, right? Like that is actually a really great place. Yep, creativity comes from space. Exactly that same thing. I'm not feeling under time pressure. I'm feeling like there's time and there's room for me to think creatively. Awesome. Okay. One more comment. Love the reframe. Keeping in mind the benefits of stopping for a while and why we're allowing to slow ourselves down. Yeah, nice. Very good. Okay, so let's talk about chronic stress. And I don't want to hammer this on because I think most people understand that chronic stress is not a good thing. What worries me is we talk about it not being a good thing, but we don't seem to take it very seriously. It's like we've gone, oh, it's awful, but there's nothing we can do about it. And I fundamentally think that is a problem. If we've decided not to do anything about it, then we've lost before we've even started. So chronic stress gets you into a state where you are actually doing physical damage to your body, and some of that is not reversible. So where you get epigenetic change, where you get cardiovascular damage, where you get immune disorders or chronic inflammation, all of those things are really, really hard to turn around. So this is my plea to take this set of tools, probably, to apply them first of all to yourselves, because that's where everything starts to change, and then to help teams to understand this as well. This is not just about performing better on the day at work, it's also about looking after your own health over the long run, so you can spend good quality time with your family, as well as be really successful in careers and help your team to do the same. So chronic stress, not at all pretty. Acute stress, small doses, right? As I said before, we evolved to deal with short, sharp doses of stress. They're good for us, but they need to be in relatively small doses. And so there are parts of the brain that need to integrate here, they need to work together. When we're in overwhelmed zone, we are being pushed into that unconscious brain. We're being pushed into instinct, into habits, into heuristics, kind of very simple frameworks for the way that things work. We cannot access the conscious brain that allows us to do impulse control, that allows us to do planning, that allows us to be creative and flexible, unless we're able to come back out of that overwhelmed zone into the challenged or peak performance zone. So just bearing in mind that acute stress is fine up to a certain level. So 2 ways that stress can sink your stuff, in summary: chronic stress, which can take you towards poor health, for you and team, and overwhelm, which can lead to very poor decisions, poor learning, poor creativity. Any questions? Anything else that comes up for people there? Cool, let's move on. How are we going for time? All right. So lots of examples coming to mind. All right. Maybe we'll get into that in the context of strategy. So I think hopefully I've convinced you now that we need to think about stress a little bit more granularly than perhaps we do a lot of the time. What does that mean for stress strategy? So by background, I'm a management consultant. I am used to working with people typically on their financials and their budgets. So we talk about how can we reduce cost, and we talk about how can we increase revenue. Actually, the way that our bodies work, way more complicated than the worst budget in the largest corporate, but it's still about helping our bodies understand, find the way through that balance between expending resources and regaining resources. So we want to be able to, in the same way that we want to increase revenue for a large organization, we want to increase our resources by increasing our total time in calm, and we want to reduce cost, we want to reduce stress by taking out that unnecessary time in challenged or in overwhelmed. So it doesn't mean we're eliminating them altogether. It's not the end of the world if you have a really shit week and everyone's difficult and you keep getting pushed into that overwhelmed zone. What we're talking about here is the gaps that we fill in between those peaks when we don't really need to, and the extra peak, the extra high peaks that we get into as a result from that. So let's start with stress strategy element number 1, which is just more time in calm. And so coming back to that idea that we can be bored in calm, we're more likely to be bored in that calm zone if we're understimulated. And like I said, that's probably something that we shouldn't be quite so allergic to as we currently are. But there are aspects of calm, there are varieties or flavors of calm, which are more than just sleep or more than just vegging on the couch. In fact, I would argue, and we can talk about this one maybe in a separate session, Nick, the kind of thing that we tend to default to when we're just vegging at the end of the day, so scrolling or flicking through Netflix or whatever, they tend to go really hard on our dopamine system, which is not a super way actually of allowing our bodies to rest. So thinking about really getting into the parasympathetic zone here, like getting into that space where the parasympathetic nervous system is in charge, there's actually more than just sleep that you can rely on. And so the way that we talk about it in the tank system is we talk about moving, and it's gentle movement that's most useful here. So if you're doing high intensity workouts, I am not going to discourage you. That's terrific. Just know that they're not the best way of dealing with stress hormones like cortisol. They will, particularly if you do them at the end of the day, they will actually raise cortisol. So if you're going to do them at the beginning of the day, ideally. But in between times, give yourself an opportunity to do gentle movement, because that is one of the best ways for your body to just flush all of that stuff out and get the opportunity to recover. Puts you into moving slowly and breathing, particularly breathing with other people, which is why things like martial arts and yoga are particularly effective. That sends this very strong signal to your body that it's safe. Creativity, fun, honestly, just doing something for the hell of it, things that are kind of hands-on, things that put you back in your body. These are great ways also of activating the parasympathetic nervous system. Connecting with people, so the social contact, people who sing in choirs get a massive parasympathetic nervous system activation. But it can also be connection to place, and there's an increasing amount of research on this, which is really interesting connection to Indigenous wisdom that we have often undervalued. A connection, a meaningful connection to place, the ability to notice what's going on in the natural environment around you is really effective in activating the parasympathetic nervous system. Time to reflect, to process, to make sense of things, to put words to perhaps feelings or events that are a bit complicated and still kind of trying to settle in your brain. Reflecting as part of a journal, or even just at the end of the day, retelling the day without getting into kind of, rehearsing and venting. And we'll talk a little bit about that as a poorer habit, but reflecting on the day constructively with your people. So whoever it is that you trust at the end of the day to talk to, great opportunity to just process and get rid of the stress of kind of, amorphous things that have happened, or unclear, ambiguous things that have happened during the day. Uncertainty is really expensive for the body, so making sense of things is really important. Rest, obviously sleep is the absolute pinnacle of recovery, but it doesn't just have to be sleep. If you've got problems with sleep, then practices like yoga nidra, or as Dr. Huberman likes to say, non-sleep deep rest. So anything that kind of gets you into deep rest is great. And the opportunity to create routines. Routines really signal to your body that everything's fine. I know what's coming next. Oh, look, I predicted that, and that's what happened. That's terrific. I feel very safe in that environment. So think about, if there is amongst that very large group of things that you could be doing, to be spending more time in calm without necessarily feeling bored, if there's something you want to make a bit more time for during the course of the week, I'll just give you a minute to think about that. I've got yoga sends a signal to your body that things are safe. Love that. Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting how much of the current scientific focus is on ancient wisdom. So terrific that we're really, we're not taking it as read, but also really interesting to see a kind of rediscovery of a lot of things from a different knowledge tradition starting to make sense. And I like cleaning and decluttering to relax, a bit unique, hey? Yes, but also comes back to a calm environment. So being able to look at your environment and see calm, and honestly, exerting control. There's a bit of exerting control in decluttering as well. Like, I can't really control everything in other parts of my life. At least I can control the space around me. Yeah, it helps me be more calm when I have an organized house too. Movement, routine. Yes, movement and routine with the decluttering. Please come to my house. Yep, cool. And hanging out with the chickens. Such an important thing, Nick. Actually, I didn't mention specifically in the context of connecting. Pets animal, we just love our animals around us as well. They're, you know, furry family. So that connection to not just to other people, but to place and to our animal kin as well is really important. Awesome. Yes, they're very destructive helpers. No, not great for the garden. But anyway. All right. So stress tactics, a little bit more time in calm doesn't necessarily mean being bored, but if there's a bit of boredom involved, well, that's not the end of the world either. Let's talk about being less challenged over the course of the day. And like I said, being in the challenge zone is terrific when you need to be in the challenged zone, but when we're spending time that's not necessary, what we're doing is drawing down resources when we could be topping them back up. So there are external signals that drive us into challenged, which we can defend against with a few different tactics. The most important one is setting boundaries. So being able to say, for example, and I love the legislation for this one, I am offline from X time to Y time because that's my time with Z. Whether Z is family, and quite often it is, or Z is playing golf, or Z is whatever it is that you want to do for calm, I am not available to you through that period of time. And unless you are in emergency response, there is absolutely no reason in any workplace that you cannot switch off for a period of time and stick to that rule. So again, you know, I've worked in management consulting. It took me quite a long time to realize this, but being able to just say no, both to people who I reported to and to my clients, made the world of difference. So setting boundaries is the starting point. Saying no nicely to things that are outside your capacity to deliver, really important. And asking for help. We so often miss the opportunity to raise a hand and say, I'm underwater here. I need to offload something, or I need some help. Even if it's just to reframe the work that needs to be done. You know, is it really a day's worth of work, or is this something that I could get to good enough in an hour? That's a conversation that's well worth having. And conversely, as a leader, being open to those conversations, modeling those conversations, opening the conversation itself with folks in your staff to check where they're up to. Are they setting the right boundaries? Do they feel empowered to say no? Do they need help? Have they completely misunderstood your request for that thing that you thought would take an hour as something that they need to spend a week on? So external, as I said before, we quite often internalize external systems. So sometimes, and I've certainly heard this in workshops that I've run, the person who is pushing me past my boundaries is me. I am my own worst enemy. So those boundaries that you're communicating to others, if you're not sticking to them yourself, they're not going to be effective. Schedule breaks. So between those periods of peak performance, those meetings, whatever it is that you're needing to get into peak performance zone for, make sure that you're giving yourself the opportunity to come back down from that experience, to come into calm regularly during the course of the day. And what I like from, and this is a Buddhist saying from one of Thich Nhat Hanh's books, which is to change the peg. And this is the kind of internal chatter that we have around things not being good enough. It's not ready to go. It's not perfect yet. I didn't do that well. I know the next thing's going to be more challenging. All the unhelpful internal statements that you're making, your worries and your rumination. The great thing about being only able really to do one thing at a time, we are single point attention creatures. We cannot multitask. It's a complete myth. So if you can only focus on one thing, change the peg, remove the thoughts that are unhelpful, not by trying to avoid them, but by replacing them with something else. So if you have habits that are pushing you into, because the brain is not really great at telling the difference between what's really happening and it's just imagining. If you're projecting yourself forward in time, or you're projecting yourself back in time to challenging situations, recognize that you're doing it, a little bit similar to the conversation we just had, lady, recognizing that you're doing it and replacing it with, well, a lesson that I learned from that situation was, or I can be prepared for that future situation by. So actively changing out what's stuck in your brain as a thing to ponder with a more constructive set of thoughts, and you might want to write those down, is going to be very helpful in bringing you back from that challenged state when you don't need to be there. And obviously, if you're also coming out of challenge and into something that's a little bit diverting in calm, it's going to be harder to focus on, to fill your brain up, to fill those kind of troughs up with kind of the busy thoughts that we quite often have. So less time in challenge, not no time in challenge. Obviously, we want to be there pretty regularly, but less time in unnecessarily challenged. And then finally, less time in overwhelmed. And this, I think, is where a lot of the bits and bobs, the little tips and tricks that we get are actually really, really useful. When you recognize you're overwhelmed, there is just a world of, I'll have the opportunity, obviously, through Nick to share this one if you want to cut it out as to print it out and cut it out as a kind of deck of potential things to do when you're feeling yourself getting a little bit into that overwhelmed zone. This is where all of those what we quite often talk about as the full suite of stress tactics, the 10-minute exercise of, a little bit of stretching or humming or chewing gum or giving yourself a jaw or a shoulder massage. There are a lot of different things we can draw on. But simply recognizing that that's where you are and knowing that you've got one or two things that you can go to bring yourself back into that challenged zone, or ideally back into calm more quickly, these are really useful things to be able to do. So I won't spend a whole lot of time on this, but if there are questions afterwards, or if you want to share things that work for you, that's a great thing to do as well. So we are almost at time. I just want to come back to this one element, which I think someone has already raised in the chat, which is terrific. We quite often talk about work-life balance, and I think that's a problem because it's clear, we quite often think we're clear about what work is. And by work, we almost always mean paid work. And then we just lump everything else on the other side, life. And I don't think that's the right way to think about what we're trying to balance. I think unpaid work belongs with work, and it's invisible in most contexts in our culture. But in particular, in this context, we forget that unpaid work, home and family life, can generate stress, particularly those of us who are in the sandwich generation, looking after kids and elders as well. But there are other sorts of non-paid work stress that come up and are really important to recognize there. And conversely, work can be a source of recovery as well. It's a place where we connect with people around a shared meaning. It's a place where we have a lot of fun sometimes if we're working on stuff that's really engaging. So work-life balance doesn't really work for me as an analogy. Yes, I love that you're highlighting unpaid work. It's so important. It absolutely is. And it's invisible. I work in this area and I forget at the end of the day, why am I so tired? Oh, it's because I also did the laundry. There's so much, we ourselves forget the amount of work that we do. So hence the name, Tank. We're talking about a physiological system that operates as a balance between stress and recovery. Recovery to top ourselves back up, stress to draw down on when we need to draw down on it, and understanding that kind of level and trajectory. So how are you going in that balance over time is what's going to keep you and your staff out of burnout. And that is it. I'm so grateful that you challenged this expression. It's all life, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely. It is all life. And paid work's a big part of it, right? Like, let's not deny that, but it's not the whole thing. Awesome. All right. So that's it. Stay in touch. That's the QR code for our website where you can find all our contact details, or reach out on LinkedIn. You'll find me under Helen Lawson Williams. It's sometimes a benefit to have a really long name.
I just want to say a huge thank you, Helen. I know that there's been a lot of chat in the chat, and a lot of appreciation for that. So thank you so much for sharing your insights and your wisdom. I love the way that you look at things, and it's not just that, as I said badly at the start, not just band-aiding the symptom. Burnout is not the reason for the issues at work. It is a symptom of other causes. So I really appreciate that. What I'm going to do now is actually stop the recording so that we can have a chat with the people who were able to make it live.